Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me, Danny. It's really a real pleasure to be back in Alberta. I'm here usually twice a week. So excuse my English. It's not let's say my usual language. So I will be talking about secession today. So I will not talk about the reasons why Alberta should stay inside Canada. In fact, I will more or less make the point of secession. And I'll explain from the experience of Quebec and from other parts of the world also, what are the pros and cons and what to look for and what to do and what not to do also. By the way, I had a bad joke. I think I'm going to say it. I feel a little bit like a member of the Ku Klux Klan in full garb coming to a convention of African American people, but being warmly welcomed. Okay, so why a secession for the West? Well, first of all, let's be clear. The West is no longer part of a winning federal majority in Parliament.
Excuse me for 1 second.
Okay.
Jackie just was in the ladies' washroom and she left her phone with all her credit cards in the ladies' washroom. Did someone pick it up and either bring it to your table in hopes of finding who? It's back there. That's what we needed to know. Okay. Pardonnez-moi.
Well, it was for a just cause. Okay, so the West is no longer part of a federal majority. In fact, you can elect a federal majority government without the West. And the West voted en bloc for the Conservatives, and they're in opposition right now. Another reason for secession is that contrary to Quebec, the West is not willing to vote for different parties. I believe that part of the power of Quebec inside Confederation is due to the fact that Quebecers are willing to vote for different parties. For example, they voted, a majority of MPs from Quebec in the federal parliament once were from the Bloc Québécois under Lucien Bouchard, were liberals under the Chrétien government, were conservatives under Mulroney, and they even elected a majority of NDP MPs under Jack Layton. So they're willing to change their votes according to their own interests, in fact. So for this reason, different parties are vying for Quebec votes. And it's not the case for Western votes because more or less, most parties believe that people from the West are going to vote Conservative. So for Conservatives, well, it's an easy, these are easy votes. And for other parties, well, you don't even bother, in fact. So you're looking for other votes. A third reason is that the rest of Canada is preventing the West from attaining its potential. Pipelines, I think, is the best example, but also perhaps WTO, World Trade Organization rules, would create more trade than the present rules inside Canada. And perhaps it would be easier to trade for the West if it were independent. And well, the process of secession, well, might create some leverage for Alberta. Should they go that way to the end or simply use it as leverage? Well, that remains to be seen, but at least the process, I think, would be a good idea. Next slide. Okay, so what's secession? It's simply the fact that a part of a country or a big grouping decides to leave. So there are many, many examples in history. Czechoslovakia, which became the Czech Republic and the Slovakian Republic, or the Slovak Republic. Brexit, which is still going on. Quebec, which, well, didn't make it. Kurdistan, which is not making it either. Yugoslavia. Texas was once part of Mexico and became independent, and after that became part of the United States. So there are a lot of examples in history. There are now international rules governing secessions. For example, regarding assets and debt, there are rules. You don't have to fight over these rules. They're pretty simple. It's a per capita basis. It's done that way all over the world. And a lot of research has been done in economics and political science about secessions. So I'll talk to you about insights from game theory, which is a branch of mathematics, and from real-world examples also. And I'll try to keep it short. Next. Okay, so what we know? Well, we know that if it's done in violence, well, there are very, very high costs. If it's done, and that happens almost exclusively in the case of dictatorships. In democracies, there are almost no examples of democracies that fought a civil war, in fact, over a partition. Or one example is the American Civil War. But there were, let's say, the problem of slavery was such a big problem that I think it led in part to a civil war. But otherwise, there are no civil wars. And what we know from experiences is that costs are low when there's a democratic transition to two countries, for example, and costs go from zero to the equivalent of a recession. And we weather a recession every 10, 15 years. It's no big deal. Well, it's no big deal either for a secession. And we also know that there are no lasting effects. A lot of research has been done on Quebec, on the process of the Quebec separation, for example, that lasted for a good more than 20 years. And we know that it had short-run effects, but didn't have any long-run effects, in fact, on Quebec. So in the long run, will it be good or will it be bad? Well, it depends. Will ties be maintained between the two partners that separate? That's a big factor. And the other one is the public policies that are put into place after separation. And I have a rather high confidence that the West would probably produce better public policy than what we have right now. So for that reason, I think you could be optimistic. Okay, next one. Okay, so some insights from game theory. So I should have said that at the beginning. I work part-time for the Montreal Economic Institute as an associate researcher, but my full job is I'm on the faculty of the Department of Applied Economics at HEC Montreal, which is the University of Montreal Business School, and I teach game theory. So I'll talk a little bit about that, but I don't have 3 hours for that, so I'll try to make it very, very short. So game theory is the branch of mathematics that deals with strategic interaction. So what's that? Well, it's what happens when you put in competition, let's say, two or more parties that have different objectives that are maybe are in conflict over objectives. And the result that each party gets depends not only on their decision, but on the other party's decisions also. So that's what happens when you have strategic interaction, and it can be reduced into a game. And a game has rules and etc. So we'll try to look at a simultaneous game, and after that we'll look at something more closer to the Alberta experience. So next one. Okay, so this is the best known game probably. It's called A Prisoner's Dilemma. I don't know if anyone has ever heard of it. Prisoner's Dilemma? Yeah, a few of you. Okay, so we have here Bonnie and Clyde who've been arrested. They were driving a stolen car. Once they were arrested, the police officers open the trunk and they find a body in the trunk. But there's no proof that they killed the person. There's no DNA of the body on them. Their DNA is not on the body either. So if they both shut up and deny the crime, well, they both get 2 years in prison. So the two numbers in the square at the bottom right are if they both deny. So we have Bonnie and Clyde. If they both Confess, thank you. If they both confess, well, they get a much higher sentence, 15 years each. So the minus is because it's not good for them, because they confess. But there will be no procès. Court trial, thank you. There will be no trial, so because of that, they can negotiate something not too bad, so it's 15 years each. Now, if one of them denies and the other one confesses, well, the denier gets here 0. The denier is, in fact, a stool. No, the denier, I'm sorry. The confessor is the stool, and the denier gets the full accusation and gets here 30 years in prison, and the confessor gets out free. So if you look at this game, what's best for both players as a team, let's say? Yeah, well, for society, it's probably 30 years each, but here for the group of 2 players, it's 2 years each. Okay, it's the best they can get. However, if you look at their strategies, they cannot sign a contract, they cannot really interact. They're in 2 different cells. Well, they'll have to ask themselves, well, what's the best for me? Well, let's put ourselves in Bonnie's shoes. If Clyde's decide to confess, well, the best thing for Bonnie is also to confess. This way she gets 15 years instead of 30. And if Clyde decides to deny, well, the best thing for Bonnie is to confess again. So this means that in this case, Bonnie will confess whatever. And it's symmetrical, which means that Clyde will also confess, and the equilibrium of the game is that both confess. And that's called a Nash equilibrium. Okay, and it's suboptimal. In fact, it's bad for both players. So this is something that can happen, and this means that the equilibrium of a game can be good or it can be bad for the players also. So we'll take a look at that. Okay, next one. Okay, so in a Nash equilibrium, when you play a game, and there would be a game between the West and the federal government or the rest of Canada, if there's a referendum on a question, well, the equilibrium, the outcome is not necessarily the best for the for both players. Getting the right one requires conditions, or maybe changing the rules also, and I'll say a few words about that. For the country that loses part of its territory, it's very important to understand that it could like or it could want to punish the other side. But usually, in any interaction, when you punish the other side, you're also punishing yourself. Okay? And so this puts limits on the punishment that the other side will want to inflict on the other side. Let's take a look at the next slide, please. Okay, so I drew a very hypothetical matrix of possibilities for negotiation after a referendum between Alberta and Quebec. So let's, I could have drawn the matrix with different numbers, and we would have had different, Nash equilibria. But this is just an assumption here, but it's going to help us think a little bit about what happens after a winning referendum in the West. Okay, so the West has, the rest of Canada has 2 possibilities. If there's a massive yes in the West for separation or secession, well, they can offer a good deal to the West or a bad deal. By offering a bad deal, they punish the West, but they punish themselves also. By offering a good deal, well, they make it probably more possible that Alberta will eventually separate, but it's better for them if there's eventually separation. So the numbers in each square, the number on the left is for the West, and the number on the right is for the rest of Canada. And as I told you, I invented these numbers. Okay, so let's assume that the rest of Canada plays first, which means that they make an offer, and it's either a very bad offer or a good offer. Okay, so if an offer is made, well, Alberta then, or the West, has three possibilities. Accept the deal, as it is. Stay in Canada, which means, well, never mind. Or thirdly, Wexit with no deal, if they don't like the deal. Okay, so let's look at what happens if there's a bad deal that's offered. Well, the best thing for Alberta with this matrix would be to stay in Canada. Okay, and we assume here that both sides know the numbers. Simply, why would they stay in Canada? Well, because maybe popular opinion would go against leaving if there's a very bad deal. By the way, that's the case of Brexit right now. Okay, the European Union is offering a very bad deal to Britain right now. The other possibility is that the rest of Canada offers a good deal. Well, with the numbers I've put on the board, well, the West should accept in that case. So there are two possibilities here. In fact, a bad deal is offered and Alberta stays, and a good deal is offered and Alberta leaves. Well, what deal should Canada offer in your mind? With these numbers, a bad deal. You offer a bad deal, so this way the West stays. That's more or less what the European Union is doing right now. So, and that's not what you want, I guess. So, are there ways out of there? Well, yeah, there is one way. Put the stay in Canada option out of the picture entirely. And if you do that, well, the best option for Canada is to offer a good deal then. So if you put out the line stay in Canada, well, it changes completely the equilibrium. So this means that strategies in negotiation, outcomes of different things that happen, such as the percentage of yes in the referendum, all these things matter a lot when you're there. So it might be very interesting to change the rules and to make sure that the rules are in the West's interest when you enter such a game. Next one, please. Okay, so what are the optimal strategies? For Canada, it's pretty obvious. Drive a hard bargain. Be very, very tough with the West. Scare people as much as you can. By the way, that's what we saw in Quebec also. Okay, so we have experience with that. If it doesn't work, eventually strike a good deal, okay? Because the rest of Canada does not want to punish itself. For the West, well, first of all, hope for a very large majority in a referendum. If you get a very large majority, you can take the stay in Canada option off the table completely and announce it. And take the stay off the table. So that's really what's really important for the West, in case you decide to follow this route. Next one. Okay, now a few words about what people are not talking about. And quite frankly, I'm a little flabbergasted by the fact that some of these things have not come up until now. First of all, if there's a Wexit, would the rest of Canada implode? Can you make the assumption that the rest of Canada would stay together? I'm not so sure about that. First of all, Ontario would represent very close to 50% of the population of the rest of Canada if Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta left. That would be certainly very unpopular in Quebec, which would see one province, in fact, have the final say on pretty much everything. By the way, there are three ways for Quebec to become independent. I've always felt that it could either leave through a referendum, get kicked out, or maybe see Canada disappear. And until very recently, I thought that if Quebec were ever independent, it would be because it would be kicked out of Canada, in fact. But now I'm not so sure. I think it's not quite impossible that, in fact, Quebec would eventually become independent simply because Canada ceased to exist. But we'll see. So there's also the remote possibility that after a Wexit, you don't have a federal government to negotiate with. for a good while. And maybe in the case of Wexit it's not as possible, but in the case of Quebec in 1995, let's recall that the Liberals had a majority in Parliament, the federal Parliament. They had a huge number of MPs from Quebec. If you took them out from the Parliament, in fact, they didn't have power anymore. So who's going to negotiate? So that was certainly a question that should have been asked before 1995. So this is something that you have to think about. So this also leaves a possibility open for a new Canada, in fact. If Canada disaggregates and the West is leaving, well, maybe it's possible to do what, for example, John has been suggesting, recreate a new Canada. So perhaps that's the start of it. Now, another thing that people are not talking about is what happens if you lose a referendum. If you lose it by 1%, well, yeah, you're going to scare the other part and maybe things will change. But if you lose it at 40% or less, you're much weaker after the referendum. And you've lost all the leverage that you could have, well, you've lost it. So this is something that you have to think about also. In fact, there's a quite important possibility of losing the leverage you have if it doesn't go as you hope. And the worst possibility is maybe winning with 51 or 52% of the vote. Because then the scare tactic by the rest of Canada, and especially the federal government, becomes an imperative. Because if you scare people enough, polls will show that the winning side only has 35 or 40% of agreement in the polls. So then, well, what do you do when you're there? It's difficult to negotiate if your option that you've won by 51% is very, very weak in the polls. So there are two dangers: winning with a very small majority, or losing very badly. So this could be very problematic. Next one. Oh, yeah, this one. Sorry. And another one, exactly at the bottom, no one's been talking about First Nations. And that's a very, very important card in the game. So I'll say a few words about that. So next one. Okay, so I'll jump to the next to last one right now, on this slide. Have agreements with First Nations before you have a referendum, so you have them on board. So this will be very divisive. We saw that in Quebec, where First Nations representatives said, well, if Quebec is leaving the Federation, well, we're staying with Canada. So this could lead to a partition of the territories that are leaving. So it's very important to have an agreement before you move to that option. In fact, I think it's quite possible, because they're not really served well in Canada right now, First Nations, it's quite possible to have an agreement and to have them on board massively. But you have to do your homework. Still this one. So what to do? Well, make agreements with First Nations. Send credible messages right now about the fact that you're not joking, that you're not testing the water. You're really going down that path, and start by opting out whenever possible. So I think that Kenny's idea is very good. So opt out of everything. So you're going to send a very clear message and maybe scare some people on the other side. Don't do a referendum unless you're reasonably sure to have a massive majority. So as I said, well, don't go to the killing grounds. You'll be much, much weaker if you do that. So this means that you also need to plan for a loss. Okay, so what do you do if you lose? You have to have a plan B. And you don't do that on the fly. Think about that beforehand. Make the tent as large as possible. The Parti Québécois had a very, very large tent in 1995, and it came to a whisker of winning, in fact. And if you look at the Parti Québécois right now, well, it's a far left and green party. So the tent has shrunk a lot. So if you look at the Parti Québécois, from 1976 to 1995, it included far-right members and even members of the provincial legislature, such as Jacques Brassard, far-left people, all the horizons were there. It was really a big coalition. And this means that you don't plan that as for an election. Okay, for an election, well, you have your program and you're going to go for your voters, and the important thing is to get not a clear majority, but a relative majority to get elected. You need to have more elected members of parliament than the other side. But with this, you need to have as much people as possible on site. So this means that you absolutely need to not make it a right-wing thing or a left-wing thing. It has to be a west thing. Okay, so you need to have a very large tent. Also, announce what you're going to do in advance. So before a referendum, say that if you have a majority, the process is starting, and agreement or not with the rest of Canada, after 2 years, it's independence. Okay, so you need to fix, otherwise they'll simply drag it for forever. We know that from Brexit. So you need to have that in the referendum also. People need to know that, well, if the other side is not playing fairly, well, we're out of here anyway. Okay, so you voted yes, we're out of here. And the agreement or not is not important. In Quebec, we had a big problem with that. In fact, the federal government announced we will not negotiate. So this was problematic because the yes side said, well, we want an association with the rest of Canada. So this has to be on the table, an association, but it doesn't have to be a breaking point, let's say. And finally, and I'll end with this, find international allies. So the moment you declare independence, so that's after the referendum and 2 years, we'll make sure that right away some other countries recognize you. And this is something that the Parti Québécois did. They were very diligent in there. So there were at least 10 or 12 countries that had agreed to recognize Quebec as a sovereign country the moment the referendum was won by the yes side, for example. So this is something that you don't necessarily think about, but they're very important. So I think it's my last slide. Is that it? Yeah? Is the last one? Okay. So. Well,
no, 1 more minute if you need it.
No, I don't need it. I just, for once I timed my presentation correctly.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Are you on the shot?
You'll have a